I'm Kirk Freudenberg. I'm the chairman of the Department of Classics here at Yale. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening to the 5th annual Michael I Rostovtzeff lecture. As I'm sure that all of you know, Michael Rostovtzeff was a giant in the study of the ancient world. He taught here at Yale as Sterling Professor of Ancient History and Classical Archaeology from 1925 until his retirement in 1944. This event comes to you by way of a generous support of the Sophie M. Rostovtzeff bequest. 6 years ago, as a kind of October surprise, it was brought to our attention in the Department of Classics that upon her passing, Sophie Rostovtzeff had left the department a generous sum of money that was to be used, in the words of the indenture, with the best judgment of the Department of Classics for the promotion of research in archaeology and history. We like such surprises. And thus was born not just this annual lecture, but a whole set of further projects and activities in support of the study of the ancient world at Yale University. The Rostovtzeff funds support many good causes, both social and scholarly, and these include annual fellowships for graduate students to travel to archaeological sites. Tonight's lecture is the first and main event in a 2-day Rostovtzeff Gala. I want to alert you to what else you have to look forward to. Immediately following the lecture this evening, there will be a suitably lavish reception at the Union League Cafe from 6:30 to 8:30. I invite everyone here to please join us for hors d'oeuvres and drinks and lively conversation. And if you don't know how to get to the Union League, no worries. You're almost there. It's just a block away on Chapel Street, number 1032. It's best just to join whatever group is heading over that way after the lecture, and you'll be there in 3 minutes. Then tomorrow at 9 a.m. in room 317 of this building, there will be a follow-up symposium on the nature of the Roman Empire, critical responses. Again, you're all cordially invited to attend. As the title suggests, the symposium will feature critical responses to tonight's lecture from 5 acclaimed scholars of ancient Roman history, all of whom we have brought to Yale in order to give John Matthews a hard time. But don't worry, we're pretty sure that John can hold his own. Featured respondents at tomorrow's symposium will be Josiah Osgood from Georgetown University, Michael Peachin from New York University, Carlos Noreña from the University of California at Berkeley, David Potter from the University of Michigan, and Noel Lenski from the University of Colorado. A truly stellar crew, and we are delighted to have them all here. Please don't miss it. Then finally tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. there will be a private tour of the newly installed Dura Europus rooms at the Yale Art Gallery, led by Lisa Brody, the curator of the exhibit. If you haven't yet managed to see the materials that came to light as a result of Rostovtzeff's excavations, they are all there now, finally on display in a spectacular setting that I'm sure would have made Rostovtzeff very pleased. The exhibit really is a must-see. Now for a few words of thanks before I turn this over to Joe Manning, and he will have his own words of thanks to add, and so I'm not going to try to cover everyone on my own. First, thanks to all of you for coming out this evening, to students especially, both undergraduate and graduate. And yes, we do notice when you come to these things. We are watching, but in a good way. And to our stalwart friends of the classics here at Yale, I see George Chauncey from the Department of History, Lisa Brody and Susan Matheson from the Art Gallery, Emily Bakemeyer from the Provost's office, and there are so many of you here that I dare not try to name you all. Also to Judy Goldberg and Linda Dickey-Saucier, our administrative assistants in the Department of Classics, who are behind the planning of all the events I've just described, down to the smallest details, and to Joe Manning himself. All that I've just described to you is happening this evening and tomorrow because Joe Manning has spent countless hours of hard work spread over many months to make it happen. He does this every year now, and he does it cheerfully and always with an eye towards making this the premier ancient history event in the country, which I think it certainly is. We are all the beneficiaries of your hard work, Joe, and many thanks. And finally, just one quick word about tonight's speaker, John Matthews. before I hand him over to Joe for a proper introduction. Most of you know that we have an exceptionally fine Department of Classics here at Yale. In fact, one of the premier departments in the country. And most of you also know that John Matthews was, for many years, chairman of said department. But what you may not know is how the former fact ensues directly upon the latter. It's not something that shows in a traditional CV. Some 20 years or so ago, John Matthews set out to give new life to the study of classics at Yale. He took on the project of planning, hiring, and program building, and with steady leadership and quiet determination, he succeeded magnificently. Yale, once again, was a place where big things were happening in classics, and that continued to be true after John handed off the baton to Chris Kraus. These two, I must say, have left me some very big shoes to fill. This is, in fact, John's last year of teaching at Yale, so I wanted to take just one small moment to thank him this evening for helping to make the Department of Classics at Yale not just an obvious go-to destination for the study of the ancient world, but a vibrant place where I myself and my colleagues want to work. Normally, we would not have someone from the department give this lecture, but John's stature in the field is second to none. And we, his colleagues, are delighted that with some arm twisting, he allowed himself to be so honored. Many thanks, John, and I now cede the stage to Joe Manning for the formal introduction of tonight's speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, a great good evening. Kirk Freudenberg, my wonderful colleague, has thanked just about everyone in the room who's been a part of organizing this, and so I won't go through the same list. But thank you all for all of your support. Thank you for coming as we near the ever-increasing, lengthening Thanksgiving vacation. I really appreciate the support, particularly those who have come from far away to participate in these fun couple of days I think we're in for. Tonight we celebrate two great historians. Michael Rostovtzeff, whose tomb some of us went to this afternoon to lay flowers and to remember him, in a sense the founding father of Yale ancient history, and John Matthews, who has carried, I should say is carrying on this fine tradition established in the 1920s by Rostovtzeff here at Yale, carrying on with some style and a great deal of panache. This is our fifth Rostovtzeff lecture and our major showcase for ancient history at Yale. Our past lectures have ranged quite far and wide, from examining historical geography in the context of the Roman Empire to the meaning of ancient history in a world historical context, an examination of ancient history and the resource curse, to last year, a closer look at two of the great figures in the historiography of the Hellenistic world, Rostovtzeff himself and Elias Bickerman. We turn this evening to yet another important theme in ancient history that is deeply relevant to our own world, namely an examination of the nature of the Roman Empire itself. Let me say a few words about John Matthews. I'm not going to summarize what is an ongoing magnificent career, of course, just a few highlights to set the context. John is the John M. Schiff Professor of Classics and History and came to Yale with his wife Veronica Grimm in 1996, having spent his earlier career at the University of Oxford, where he was University Professor of Late Roman History and a Fellow and Tutor at Queen's College, Oxford. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1990 and is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the London Society of Antiquaries. The main areas of research have concerned the social and cultural roots of political life in the later Roman Empire and on the making and diffusion of Roman law. His first book, Western Aristocracies and Imperial Court, AD 364 to 425 AD, which appeared in 1975, traced the fortunes of the governing classes of the late Roman West and their relations with the imperial government through the years of the disintegrating Western Roman Empire. This has the status, truly, of a classic in Roman history. That was followed in 1982 by the Atlas of the Roman World, in fact, an illustrated history of Rome from its beginnings to the time of Justinian, written jointly with his friend and colleague Tim Cornell. In 1989 came the Roman Empire of Ammianus, and in 2000, after his arrival here at Yale, Laying Down the Law, a study of the Theodosian Code. His 2000 book, my personal favorite, to be honest, for particular reasons, The Journey of Theophanes, Travel, Business, and Daily Life in the Roman East, is a translation and interpretation of a 4th century papyrus archive. It is an extraordinary achievement. One reviewer noted, quote, Matthew's professional life has journeyed not only literally in space, but also in focus. He is known for his studies of Western aristocracies and the imperial court in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, of the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, of the formidable Theodosian Code. All this work addresses what his Ammianus would approve of as negotiorum chalcedonianus, elevated matters worthy of historical inquiry. The record of Theophanes' journey, by contrast, is one of cabbages, not kings. Until recently, few historians would dare to turn their gaze thus, and certainly not in the early 1950s. It was in 1951, after all, that A.H.M. Jones famously identified a papyrus scrap as a more or less contemporary official copy of a part of a letter of Constantine, quoted in Eusebius's Life of the Emperor, and long doubted by many to be genuine. With such weighty controversies to pursue, who would choose to concentrate instead on Theophanes' quotidian trivia? It is a mark of how we and our scholarship have shifted that today the scholar who does so can be applauded, end quote. We do more than applaud that book. Another reviewer, Roger Bagnall, who is no easy reviewer, as is well known to you all, says this about Theophanes. This book is, among other things, a striking example of the kind of value that non-papyrologists can extract from papyrus documents. It is unusual in that Matthews went to the length of improving the text. It should stimulate further work on these accounts by virtue of its contributions to the text, the translations, and the analytic work done on goods and prices, end quote. And so it has indeed. It received the James Henry Breasted Prize of the American Historical Association. By the way, James Henry Breasted is my boyhood hero. Growing up, a nice Chicago boy, the founder of the Oriental Institute, and the man who pointed Rostovtzeff to the potential of Dura Europus. So you see how we all move in similar circles, even in time, as well as space. This is a prize awarded to the best book published in that year in any period of history before 1000 AD. His latest book, Roman Perspectives, Studies in the Social, Political, and Cultural History of the 1st to the 5th centuries from 2010, is a thematic collection of separate papers, some of them new and the others revised from their original versions. He is currently working on a general history of the Roman Empire, in which a second volume will present an anthology of Greek and Latin texts and translation, and also on a study of the 1st century of the city of Constantinople. Much work ahead for John Matthews. All who know him well know that John has been and is a committed teacher, both to undergraduate and graduate students. As Kirk Freudenberg mentioned, he's been a magnificent chair of the Department of Classics for many years. He's a consummate colleague and good friend. He will be sorely missed when he finally goes into full-blown, well-deserved retirement in about 18 months. And we get to enjoy him for quite a while before then, indeed. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen and dear friends, will you join me in welcoming my colleague, John Matthews, Confronting Leviathan, the Roman Empire from Hobbes to Rostovtzeff.
Thank you both for what you said. I can only quote Hans Sachs from the Meistersinger of Wagner, you do me too much honor. And if I often think, for all the work that's been mentioned, I would have done more if I'd not been so fond of Beethoven. I've been rather off colour. This is the room in which I gave my first lectures in Yale. Title clear, on the Roman Republic in 1996. And the room had not been renovated. Very decrepit, but what you could see was round the walls, they're lovely Tiffany windows. You should see them in the daylight. And there were workmen with scaffolding, and they were cleaning the Tiffany windows with methylated spirits and cloth while I spoke on the Roman Republic. And at the end I said to them, well, that must have been a very, very strange experience for you. They said, oh, no, they said, it was very interesting. I didn't know anything about the Republic, as other people will vouch for, but there I was. When I arrived in Yale in the summer of 1996, I remarked to that very modest and very great historian, now my dear friend Ramsay MacMullen, how apprehensive I was to be his successor. His reply to this perfectly truthful remark was nothing if not disarming. Don't think of it like that, he said. Think of us both as the successors of Rostovtzeff. So let me turn defense to attack by noting that Yale is not the only university affiliation that I claim to have shared with Rostovtzeff. It's not a very strong claim, and it goes back a very long way. I do, however, possess, thanks to my dear friend David Potter of Michigan, who is in the audience, of course, a copy of an Oxford lecture list for the School of Literae Humaniores, that's to say classics, for Michaelmas term, the fall term, of 1919. And here it is, the Oxford lecture list of 1919. There it is, at the very top of the list, That's a bit clearer. Under the title, heading Ancient History, The Economic History of Hellenism and Rome, 6 lectures by M. Rostovtzeff on D.Lit, a degree granted for published work. As you can see from the list, if you read down it long precedes the introduction of research doctorates as the entry to the academic profession. There were to be 6 lectures, the minimum allowed by the university for an advertised course. They were to begin on October the 25th in the Ashmolean Museum at the remarkable time of Saturday at 5 o'clock. In my time, perhaps 1919 was different, this would be taken as an indication, perhaps even a hint, that they were not expected to be very well attended. Looking down the list, there are some great names on an interesting range of topics. The epigrapher of Marcus Todd on the origins of the Greek alphabet, J. Wells, the commentator on Herodotus, on the Peloponnese, R.H. Dundas on the Greeks in the West, G.B. Grundy on the Constitution of the Roman Republic and the Geography of Roman History, E.A. Lowe on Latin Paleography, and an unknown name, N. Whatley. Herodotus and others on the Persian Wars. There's a story to tell here. Norman Whatley, by then very advanced in years, published in the Journal of Hellenic Studies of 1964 a paper on the difficulty of reconstructing ancient battles from contemporary accounts of them. His publication was quite a surprise, since it was 44 years since the paper had been delivered in Oxford 1920 at a meeting of the Oxford Philological Society, October 1920. Not that Whatley had been withholding his paper, not at all, but it had recently been cited in the preface to a widely read book, though unforgivably boring book, I think, on Xerxes' invasion of Greece. But the paper was unpublished and no one had seen it, and the publication was simply to inform a later generation of Greek historians what it had been about. Whatley's paper, delivered in 1920, drew in episodes of the First World War, of which there were only too many eyewitnesses, which made him sceptical of the reliability of any account of a battle given by the people who were in it. He had a story of somebody sent a platoon out, and when they came back, they asked the member of the platoon how many hand grenades they'd thrown. And the answer was about 30. Only about 8 were missing. They'd completely misremembered how many hand grenades they'd thrown in the stress of battle. It was a serious time, not only for Rostovtzeff, who had left Russia after the October Revolution, but for European countries faced with the loss of a generation of young men and the colossal problems of post-war reconstruction. Michaelmas term 1919 was the beginning of the first full academic year of returning undergraduates after the war. I looked in the history of my own college, Queen's, and found that 66 of those who had or would have been students and 38 old members were killed on active service. During the war, the number of undergraduates at the college was reduced to 13. In an essay published in 1954, Arnaldo Momigliano suggested that Rostovtzeff was not at ease in the atmosphere of Oxford classics. He probably didn't realise, wrote Momigliano, that the average Oxford don knew Greek and Latin much better than he did. If this is meant to imply, I think Momigliano did mean this, if it's meant to imply a corresponding narrowness of vision, it is not borne out by the 1919 lecture list. This is the bottom of it. It is quite adventurous, ending with 3 courses under anthropology, social organisation and marriage, psychology of savage religion, and methods of anthropology. There's nothing antiquated there, I don't think. Whatever the reason, Rostovtzeff quickly moved on to the University of Wisconsin and to Yale in 1925. The social and economic history of the Roman Empire appeared in 1926. It is dedicated, in gratitude for his cooperation, to my friend J.G.C. Anderson, whose name as lecturer in Roman epigraphy appears twice in the 1919 lecture list. You can see it up there, I think. Yes, on the top there. Rostovtzeff's thanks to Anderson in his preface are generous, ironically self-critical, and humorous. Last but not least, said Rostovtzeff, last but not least, he made me give a definite statement in many cases where I was inclined to remain vague. Evidently, the English mind, Anderson was Scottish, in this respect, unlike the Slavonic, dislikes a lack of precision in thought or expression. Rostovtzeff had just remarked how little the disasters of war and revolution have impaired the international solidarity of scholars. This is a fine remark, and he was one of the greatest of the scholars. Leviathan, to quote Webster's dictionary, is 1, a sea monster, 2, any huge marine animal as the whale, 3, anything of immense size and power as a huge seagoing ship, 4, a philosophic work, 1651, by Thomas Hobbes, dealing with the political organisation of society. The word derives from the Hebrew for something coiled and twisted, like the serpent that emerges from the sea in Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid to seize Laocoon and his sons. Here's the Hellenistic version of Leviathan. Leviathan's star turn, if I may put it like this, is as the invincible sea monster of the Book of Job, with which Hobbes must have been familiar, his father being vicar, though somewhat taken to drink, of Malmesbury, a lovely old monastery town in the west of England. In the frontispiece to Hobbes' book, Leviathan, of 1651, Leviathan is shown as a giant rising from the sea, with the face, I think the face of a monarch, and brandishing the symbols of army and church. The body of the monster is composed of individual human beings, which you can't see very clearly on this rather fuzzy image I've got. But the body is entirely composed of human beings. Better be part of Leviathan than one of his victims. Hobbes will argue that Leviathan, the organised state, is a protection against the fate to which man's own nature has condemned him. Hobbes does not develop, as later writers would, a theory of social contract based on this raw recognition of the situation. There he is, Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury. Hobbes is not known as a commentary on Roman history. Much better for his translation of Thucydides, published in 1628 when Hobbes was 40 years old. He was born to a mother whose labour pains, according to Aubrey's Brief Lives, were induced by news of the Spanish Armada. Thucydides was a congenial text, already Hobbesian in its unsentimental view of the growth and destruction of empire and the misuse of the powers of the state. Listen to them speaking in unison, Hobbes translating the Melian dialogue. I blame not those who are willing to reign, but those that are most willing to be subjects. For it is the nature of man everywhere to command such as give way, and to be shy of such as assail. Hardly known at all is an early essay of Hobbes on Roman history, a discourse upon the beginning of Tacitus. There's the title page of it, printed in 1620 without attribution of authorship. A manuscript version of the text was found in Hobbes' writings, connected with his work as a tutor at Chatsworth House in Derbyshire in England. It was in a short course of lectures on these very chapters, the beginning of Tacitus, that I first set eyes on that other master of the cool appraisal, Ronald Syme. They narrate, Annals 1 to 15, they narrate the regrettable but fully deserved end of the Roman Republic in favour of the rule of one man established by Augustus, the sacrifice of political liberty in the interests of peace and settled government. As Syme put it in his book, The Roman Revolution, published just 2 weeks before the outbreak of the Second World War, liberty or stable government, that was the choice facing the Romans themselves, and I've tried to answer it precisely in their fashion. Tacitus is describing in these chapters, and Hobbes is commenting on, a transition from an abuse of political liberty under the Republic to a time when the interests of peace required that power be conveyed upon one man. It's an enlargement of perspective recognised immediately by Hobbes, and it's an important formulation. The Roman state did not consist in the magnitude of that one city of Rome, but in the multitude and greatness of provinces that were subject to it. The provinces welcomed the change, for they mistrusted the government of the Senate and people because of the contentions of great men and the covetousness of the magistrates, for the aid of the laws was weak, being infringed by force, canvassing, and lastly by money. It always sounds to me very up to date, this. The provinces, he continues, the provinces would have been content with a monarchy or tyranny, rather than to be troubled with so different and ill humours of diverse men. There may also be covetousness in magistrates, when one has the sovereignty being a fault of the person, and not of the form of the state. But in a factious and divided commonwealth, it cannot be otherwise. The point being that in a monarchy and a tyranny, you may get bad government, but in a democracy, you're bound to, because the number of people there are bound to make it like that. Hobbes takes no view as to which form of state should begin the analysis, whether monarchy, oligarchy, or democracy. This will be a matter of historical argument or circumstance. Every form of state will have its virtues and vices, some more than others, to be studied as it turned out, but any state is better than none. As a government is better than anarchy, liberty may have to be curtailed. Censorship may be justified. It's startling to read that Cremutius Cordus, executed under Tiberius for calling Brutus and Cassius the last of the Romans, writing it at a time which would not permit a man so much as to look back on the former state of the Commonwealth, was perhaps worthily punished, worthily punished. That's what he says of Prometheus Cordus. Hobbes' social contract, he doesn't call it this, is not to achieve a higher aim in the betterment of society, but to defend society of the consequences of its absence. As a Roman senator said, you hope for a better emperor and put up with the one you have. Hobbes is not endorsing tyranny, for some forms of government are better than others, but pointing out the consequences of having no government at all. Apart from his realism, Hobbes is notable for his empiricism and his curiosity. Problems just intrigued him. One question, how could the eye of a hawk focus so clearly on its object with a lens of so short a focal length? It was inspired by his observations while out hunting with his patrons in Derbyshire. A writer on optics as well as on political philosophy, he made arguments on the subjectivity of perception. How can I know more than what I see, or infer anything beyond it? By a simple observation. It is true, said Hobbes, that our knowledge of the world external to ourselves is based on our perceptions of it. But our perceptions change all the time. The most likely explanation is that there's an external world causing them to do so. And we form a consensus with our fellow men as to what this external world is like. So with human society, the need to accept some sort of consensus in the formation of a state is inferred from man's individual nature, in which all he can be sure of is his own will to survive, which he assuredly will not do in isolation. If during his European travels Hobbes, a fascinating thought, met Galileo and Descartes, I'm absolutely fascinated by the thought of Hobbes, Galileo discussing optics. Gibbon's debt to European thinking is to a later and I suppose less scientific tradition. The distinctly post-Hobbesian Enlightenment represented by Montesquieu, Voltaire and other writers whom we call collectively philosophes. Gibbon's teenage journal of his grand tour in the mid-1750s was written in French, as were some early writings of his on the kingdom of the Medes and the Emperor Julian the Apostate. His mastery of French as well as classics was fortified by a period of residence in Lausanne, where his father sent him for detoxification after his foolish conversion to Roman Catholicism as an undergraduate at Oxford. He sent him up to Lausanne to be cleaned out. It was at Lausanne that he saw Voltaire acting in a play, and as his courtship of Suzanne Curchod, which also encountered his father's disapproval, stiffened by financial considerations. At Crécy and Lausanne, I indulged my dream of felicity. But on my return to England, I soon discovered that my father would not hear of this strange alliance, and without his consent, I was destitute and helpless. A better-known description of the episode does not appear in all versions of Gibbon's memoirs of my life. I sighed as a lover, I obeyed as a son. My wound was insensibly healed by time, absence, and the habits of a new life. And my cure was accelerated by a faithful report of the tranquility and cheerfulness of the lady herself, who realized what she got out of, I think. After hard times of her own, Mademoiselle Curchod attracted the attentions of a rich banker and became Madame Jacques Necker. Much later, Gibbon visited the couple in Paris, by which time Necker had become the French finance minister and his wife a great hostess, admirably qualified to preside in the conversation of a table and drawing room. And I can't help but thinking of these two glancing over the table with all that they were thinking of. The origins of decline and fall, according to the memoirs, were in Gibbon's reflections, which vary in different details, on the ruins of the city of Rome one October evening in 1764. as I sat musing in the church of the Zoccolanti, or Franciscan friars, while they were singing Vespers in the Temple of Jupiter on the ruins of the Capitol. But my original plan was circumscribed to the decay of the city, rather than of the empire. And though my reading and reflections began to point toward that object, some years passed and several avocations intervened before I was seriously engaged in the execution of that laborious work. In the end, Decline and Fall came out less an interpretative essay focused on the causes of decline than a detailed description of a phenomenon whose essential character was not in dispute. This was already, as it were, before the court. Nobody doubted the empire declined. And really nobody doubted why, but finding out how was the interesting thing. Even the title had been anticipated by Montesquieu, with the exception of a significant phrase, considération sur les causes. Sur les causes, that is not in Gibbon, de la grandeur des Romains et de la décadence. Gibbon's advertisement of Volume 1, what we would call his blurb, speaks not of explaining, but of deducing the circumstances of the fall of Rome. And the same idea underlies his famous story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. 7 young men hid in a cave to escape the persecution of Christians conducted by the Emperor Decius in the mid-3rd century. They fell asleep in the cave, and after a few hours they woke up and sent one of their number into Ephesus to buy bread. The young man was surprised to find that the main gate of Ephesus was surmounted by a cross. In the baker's shop, his old-fashioned speech caused comment, and so did the coin of Decius they offered as payment for the bread. It turned out that the young men had been asleep not for a few hours, but for 200 years, during which time the Roman Empire had become Christianized and Ephesus a Christian city. It's a story designed in a manner of Rip Van Winkle to portray the effects of the passing in time to one who has missed the intervening process, an unexplained vision, as it were, of the future. Gibbon was not so much interested in the dramatic contrast between the ages as in the long train of events through which one became the other, deducing the circumstances of the change. This, and not mere moral reflection, is the more difficult task of the historian. Central to Gibbon's thinking is the balance between individual liberty and the power of the state. The Roman Empire was a very large institution, and it was when the scale of power required to sustain it became so great as to crush the liberties of the individuals living in it that what Gibbon called a slow and secret poison entered into the constitution. Gibbon's golden age is the age of the Antonine emperors in the 2nd century. Here he is, Antoninus Pius, the most harmless emperor ever lived. We see quite a long reign. This age saw a diffusion of individual munificence encouraged but not imposed by the state. Gibbon was thinking not only of the Roman state. For the first publication of Decline and Fall in 1776, note, Gibbon added a few footnotes to the general observations on the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, drafted some years before, with which he concluded his first engagement with the public, the end of Volume 1. We here find Gibbon referring, whatever may be the changes in their political situation, in 1776, to the 6 millions of European blood and descent already living in America, and the likely diffusion of the English language over an immense and populous continent, hailing the discovery of Australia and New Zealand, and greeting the establishment of the Royal Academy of Arts in London by His present Majesty George III. We may therefore acquiesce in the pleasing conclusion that every age of the world has increased and still increases the real wealth, the happiness, the knowledge, and perhaps the virtue of the human race. It's a difference between them that Gibbon saw well-conducted government as the means to progress to a more advanced society, where Hobbes saw it, good, bad, or indifferent, as a protection against man's inherent nature. Gibbon's belief in progress was as great as Hobbes' disbelief in human virtue. I should add, since it'll be an important theme in a few minutes, that we also see in Gibbon an unfolding of new sorts of source material, alongside the literary text which he was so familiar with. Gibbon possessed handbooks of inscriptions and coins, and he was sensitive to the physical relics of the Roman Empire. He used archaeological sites as examples of general processes. He mentions the ruins of the city of Avanches in Switzerland, which he'd seen during his grand tour of the mid-1750s. And especially, one of you, Andrew, especially the great bridge over the Tagus River at Alcantara in Spain, which in fact he had never seen. This structure is one of the most expressive monuments of the Roman Empire, because we know how it came to exist. It was built from a subscription raised by 11 local communities, whose names survived in an inscription placed on the parapet of the bridge. Gibbon drew exactly the right conclusion, and it was on the basis of such local initiatives and not on the direct interventions of emperors that the prosperity of the Roman Empire was based. He couldn't have read, the inscriptions were by long illegible, but people had been copying them down for a long time, so there were literary versions of the inscriptions. Well, I mean written manuscript versions. Decline and Fall was a very successful book, received favourably by men of letters, men of the world, and even by fine feathered ladies, Gibbon. It was reprinted at once, and of course many times since, and a wonderful critical edition was produced by David Womersley in 1994. People recognised its immense learning. It was based on a comprehensive reading of the text, the best research, and the best materials available. Gibbon had a particular delight in good maps, and expressed a sincere, though ironically detached, admiration of French ecclesiastical scholarship. He was both amazed by it and sort of stood dumbfounded before it. And this combination of the science of philosophy with the study of facts, it was a genuine, innovative work. Gibbon was never harder on his philosophes than when they got their facts wrong. But for all that, he was written in isolation from scholarly trends elsewhere. Early reviews criticised the absence of source criticism. Gibbon's intelligence as a reader of texts was not matched by systematic procedures for assessing their reliability. We are entering a different world, that of the German universities, the world of Friedrich August Wolff, who formulated the Homeric question, Barthold Niebuhr, who published Gaius Institutes from a newly discovered manuscript, analysed the sources for the history of early Rome, established a series of texts of Byzantine writers, and founded a journal for the publication of research, Bonner Jahrbucher. And there was Mommsen and his Greek history colleagues, editors of inscriptions and legal texts, not to mention Ranke, who introduced archival research to our historical writing on the modern world. There's a lot going on in Germany in this period, a lot. I wish I knew it better. What at issue in the new scholarly world is the presentation and use of these materials in such a way as could sustain new principles of interpretation. Here's an example of an inscription. It tells you a story you could learn no other way. An imperial official has had his name erased from an inscription because he's voted the wrong emperor. There's a little story there, but the only way you can get it is by knowing that. Inscriptions no longer just illustrate the systems of government, they define its character. Mommsen's doctoral dissertation from Kiel University was a study of certain minor magistrates of Rome, and he'd written essays on the trade guilds and citizen tribes. You can't do that from literary text. You need the inscription, the law, and the legal text. The Roman state appears as an array of law and public institutions, documented as much by archival material as by literary sources. It was not just that you could now view the Roman Empire from an institutional standpoint. It was inherently an institutional phenomenon, and the government itself operated under institutional constraints. We can see the implications of the new approach in the evolution of Mommsen's own writing. His History of Rome, published in 3 volumes from 1854 to 1856, under the influence of the liberal revolutions of 1848, ended with Julius Caesar, a model of the imaginative, decisive leader that Mommsen's modern world required. A continuation of the history into a volume 4 was promised to cover the Roman Empire, but never appeared. All of volume 4 that ever appeared was a title page, printed by itself, sent by Mommsen to his friends as a joke on his own 60th birthday. A sort of continuation of the history of Rome was volume 5 on the provinces of the Roman Empire, but this is a different sort of history. And then in a quite different tradition, huge magisterial books on the constitutional and criminal law of Rome. There's a great curvature in Mommsen's trajectory, from one sort of writing to another. The reason for Mommsen's failure to continue the history of Rome, as he began it, has been debated. But in my opinion, as in Collingwood's, it is realization that the new methods of Roman history, as developed by himself, had made the old way of writing impossible. I've not mentioned at all Mommsen's colossal contribution to the publication of critical texts of very major writers, major ancient writers. The texts that we use of Justinian's compilations of Roman law are still those prepared by him. We are looking at what may be called a new enlightenment, at a broader conception of the role of government and of law in social policy, as they began to cope with some of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, issues of political unification, and with new ideas of political participation. Mommsen was a different sort of liberal from Gibbon. Engaged in politics, he lost his job in Leipzig in consequence of supporting the liberal cause in 1848. His friend Otto Jahn, also a biographer of Mozart, was condemned to death in absence for the same reason. Apart from his duties as a member of Parliament for a rotten borough, I don't believe that Gibbon ever uttered a word in the House of Parliament, House of Commons, and his honorary captaincy of the Hampshire militia, Gibbon never had a job at all. Decline and Fall was completed before the outbreak of the French Revolution. But one can glimpse in the memoirs what Gibbon would have thought of that. He was all for liberty, but fraternity, equality were rather a different matter. We can't blame him for thinking this, given the horrors that ensued in Paris in the 1790s. But Gibbon shared with Tacitus a conception of liberty as that of the ruling classes, not its extension to those outside their ranks. I'd like to mention one more aspect of Gibbon's historical judgment of the contemporary world. Reflecting in the general considerations on the fall of the Roman Empire, he thought that Europe would escape the same fate because none of its nation-states, constrained by their comparable size and equality of technical development, and by diplomatic policies to maintain the balance, would be able to assert dominance over the others. They would all forever and ever be equipoise with each other. No state would ever be able to overcome the others. None of these states would be able to acquire sufficient power as to destroy freedom. Well, look at Napoleon. It's a prediction that's catastrophically wrong, as Polybius claimed that the Roman Republic would never fall because of the checks and balances built into its constitution. Rostovtzeff's Oxford colleagues of 1919 were confronted by the catastrophic failure of the nation-states of Europe to manage their own affairs. Rostovtzeff himself was confronted by the overthrow of his state by a new model of government, determined to do away with what had gone before. In articles published in the 1920s, he explicitly compared the Roman army of the 3rd century to the Red Army of his own experience, a rural population bearing arms against the urban culture of the bourgeoisie and determined to destroy it. In the larger context of the social and economic history of the Roman Empire, he dropped the explicit comparison with the Red Army, but maintained the interpretation of the 3rd century anarchy of the Roman Empire as a social movement, with the army as its spear. The interpretation takes us onto new ground, for it raises the question of the definition of a culture and how widely it can be shared in a society. We use the word to refer to the whole complex of literary, religious, and economic elements which Rostovtzeff attributed to the landed elite, which he styled the bourgeoisie. But must such a culture necessarily be linked or limited to an elite? The social movement of the 3rd century would presumably not have happened if bourgeoisie and peasantry had shared its culture. But how could they ever have done so? Rostovtzeff ended his work with a series of questions. For a culture to survive, it must be diffused over a wider population. But how can this happen? If the function of culture is to define an elite, does not its broader diffusion mean the end of it? What we also find in Rostovtzeff is a further unfolding of new narratives of Roman history, based on a yet wider range of materials and the perspectives that they create. Inscriptions we're used to from Mommsen. But now we find a transformative emphasis on the archaeology, art and material culture of the ancient world, of a world that exists firmly in space and time. This awareness of the ancient world as a material entity is the first impression recalled by Mommsen from his old student days. A lavish series of plates introduces us directly to the archaeological evidence, and the caption of each plate made us really understand what one could learn from insignificant items. You're not supposed to read the details here. This is Rostovtzeff's presentation. On one page, a selection of well-chosen illustrations on a theme, and then quite extensive captions opposite to explain how he was using them this way. This may seem obvious to do now, but it wasn't then. The caption of each plate really made us understand what one could learn from apparently insignificant items. He guides us through the streets of Rome. Pompeii. I thought you'd like this. I left on the sunglasses. Nîmes and Trèves, and showed us how the ancients had lived. If these words now seem self-evident, it is largely because of Rostovtzeff that this is so. I claim a partial exception in the case of Britain, where the paucity of literary sources and its consequence, the excellence of his archaeology, have long been recognised. The great historian Francis Haverfield, friend of Mommsen, and author of a most influential book, based entirely on the archaeological evidence, The Romanization of Britain. Here's the frontispiece, The Romanization of Britain, and it's the British version of a Medusa from the temple of the goddess Minerva at Bath. Haverfield had died on the 1st of October 1919, just over 3 weeks before the first of Rostovtzeff's 6 lectures on the economic history of Hellenism and Rome. And then there's something very new, the evidence of papyri for the social and economic history of the ancient world. Just as the systematic use of inscriptions was unknown to Gibbon, that of papyri was barely known to Mommsen. He died in 1903, at about the time of Grenfell and Hunt's excursions to Egypt that made my own Oxford College, Queen's, a centre of Egyptology in the study of papyri. The survival of papyrus, or let's call it paper, opens up new topics hardly accessible before. Topics that modern historians take for granted, ancient historians are unable to. Estate management, contracts, leases, rents, taxation, prices, daily life in all its messy detail. Rostovtzeff had already, before his arrival in Oxford, published on state contracts and land tenure, topics arising naturally from his Russian experience. Papyrus documents present a particular challenge. They open up a whole range of topics on social and economic history, but do so on a level of detail that challenges general interpretation. From an early 4th century papyrus, as Joe was kind enough to mention, I can describe the diet of a Roman official and his entourage every day for an entire month, including different grades of bread for the free men and slaves, as you see. That's of obvious general interest. But what about a divorce between two members of a family of grave diggers? Because some demon has come between us, or a contract to employ a flute girl for a party. Reminds me of the Emperor Justinian's explanation of why new laws were needed on matters that escaped his all-seeing eye. Always some new situation arises, he wrote, that has not been considered before, and requires a new solution. This is the Emperor Justinian. Is the Roman Empire then more than an endless proliferation of new situations? It often looks like it. That great historian of Rome, Peter Brunt, used to complain that it was rather like being in a darkened hall, with small patches of candlelight here and there, and nothing known about the totality of it. We used to try to cheer him up in these moods. Given what he'd achieved, he shouldn't have been saying it. It was Rostovtzeff's aim to integrate the economic and social history of the Roman Empire with this constitutional development, the thing in the same environment, and to fit the detail into the general pattern. Rostovtzeff's writing is not, at least to me, especially theoretical in character. At times it can seem that, like Gibbon, he's thinking not so much in terms of an explanatory process as giving a descriptive account of Roman society in its economic context, deducing, to paraphrase Gibbon, the economic circumstances within which the life of the empire unfolded. It's not difficult to question some of his interpretations, but for today, I think a broader appreciation is more useful. Rostovtzeff offered an understanding of the Roman Empire in terms of its economic and material culture, much as Gibbon offered one in terms of liberty, and Mommsen offered one in terms of institutions and law. He put certain issues once for all in the centre of the problem: relations between town and country, the role of the property classes, their wealth generated in the countryside but expressed in the cities. A positive evaluation against the prejudice of our literary sources of commerce and manufacture. The captions tell you what I need you to know. A sense of the diversity of life in different parts of the Roman Empire, and also of the extent to which the Roman Empire was not based on the Mediterranean. This is the famous Hadrianic satellite map of the Roman Empire. And of course the Mediterranean seems to be the core of this, and it is, but you can imagine a different angle of approach in which it would seem to be a landmass more than a sea mass. And I'm rather resisting the presently contemporary tendency to regard this as just a Mediterranean setup. Joe might have mentioned that both Veronica and I were born in the Roman Empire, and in neither of these places does one have much sense of the Mediterranean. Neither Budapest nor Leicester, UK, reminds one of the Mediterranean at all. There's one way of being non-Mediterranean. This is, of course, Hadrian's Wall. And there's another way of being non-Mediterranean. The city of Palmyra, in its desert landscape, over into the distance you get to the Euphrates River, the Persian Empire, the Persian Gulf. Nothing Mediterranean about that. And I especially value what we might call the decentralization of our perspectives. Iranians and Greeks in southern Russia, the caravan cities and dynasties of Syria. Look at this view of Palmyra. relief, the caravan leaders financing and defending caravans over the deserts. And that wonderful family portrait from Edessa in Syria, Mokimu, the family of Mokimos, 2nd, maybe 3rd century, Roman family living in Syria. The Euphrates city of Dura, the special pride of Yale, with its Christian church, its synagogue, and shrine of Mithras all together in one place at the same time. Everyone is at the centre of the world in which they live. There is no such thing as the peripheral. Everything, even that odd creature, the hippopotamus, is natural in its own environment. It is common ground between Gibbon, Mommsen, Rostovtzeff, and ourselves that the economic success of the Roman Empire was at its greatest in the golden age of the Antonine monarchy. An age so uneventful in its profound peace as to leave nothing for the historian to record. This was Gibbon. History being, as he put it, nothing more than the record of the follies, vices, and misfortunes of mankind. I'm told that there is a Chinese curse. The curse, may you live in interesting times. It's also common ground between all of us that this prosperity was not the result of the abuses of the property class, not the result of any coercive policies of the government, which intervene only to limit the abuses of the property classes, but that this situation changed to produce a very different style of government in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Gibbon has prepared us for hard times to come in his description of the Antonine age as the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. This often quoted phrase is itself a near quotation of another historian. In his history of the reign of Charles V, appearing just 7 years before the first volume of Decline and Fall, William Robertson had written of the period between the death of Theodosius in 395 to the coming of the Lombards in the 6th century as the period of the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most calamitous and afflicted. You're supposed to know that when you read Gibbon in 1776. You're supposed to know that he's quoting Robertson, and there's lurking, therefore, in Gibbon's praise of the empire, Robertson's quite contrary view. Hard times are to come, and you've got to know that by knowing Robertson. Gibbon's deliberate misquotation is to prepare us for a calamitous future, quite unlike the happy prosperity of the Antonine age, and for the effects of the slow and secret poison that began to affect the body of the state. Something that Gibbon and Mommsen provided more clearly than Rostovtzeff did is an appreciation of the political and institutional changes between the forms of government that distinguish the early and later periods of the Roman Empire. We use the terms principate and dominant to express the difference between the rule of the first citizen, a princeps, of the early empire, and the rule of the master, dominus, of the later period. Rostovtzeff does not connect the so-called anarchy of the 3rd century with the despotism of the 4th. And he's nothing to say of anything later than the collegiate government that we know, the tetrarchy, and its successor, Constantine. It is true that Rostovtzeff defined his topic not as the fall of the Roman Empire in itself, but as the end of ancient civilization, with the awkward consequence that ancient civilization seems to come to an end before the Roman Empire did. This will be a great disappointment to the conscientious emperors of the Tetrarchy. Here's the Constantius, the father of the Emperor Constantine the Great. The seriousness of the face, the seriousness of it. With their pride in the wars that we have successfully carried on, seeming to the rest of us, as to themselves, to do so to save from destruction what they still understood as the classical Roman world. These are the famous so-called tetrarchs from Venice. I won't go into details now. They can't be tetrarchs because wrong place, wrong time. Later 4th century emperors, maybe Valentinian Valens. But the same image of these people are concerned about something and are doing something about it. And I find Rostovtzeff very disappointing in saying nothing would ever help them. Diocletian, it is said, in 284, came to power with a Virgilian quotation as he struck down the Praetorian prefects before the army with the cry, "You fall by the hand of great Aeneas." It doesn't matter if this is true or not. I'm sure it's not literally true. It's how the event was presented by a late Roman source. Diocletian is a new founder of Rome. What is it then that changed the face of government, that replaced an ideology of consent in the 2nd century to one of coercion in the 4th? You'll remember Hobbes' argument against Descartesian solipsism. All we have to go on is for knowledge of the world is our perceptions of it. But our perceptions change, and the most likely explanation is that there is an external world causing them to. Now, the Roman Empire didn't exist in an unchanging world, nor did it choose the changes that met its perceptions. The Romans didn't choose to have the Goths appear on their frontiers. Look at them, here they are in the 3rd century in Ukraine and Romania, hundreds, thousands of Gothic settlements found archaeologically. They didn't choose to have the Huns migrate from the east. They didn't choose the Persian Empire of the 3rd century to conceive dreams of ancient glories by reclaiming much of the East Roman Empire, Sasanian hunting dish, 4th century, maybe 5th. They didn't invite German tribes or desert Arabs to form confederations in order to threaten them more effectively. They didn't ask the River Rhine to freeze over, permitting the great barbarian inroads of winter 406. Like a great sporting event, historical change consists of a variable interplay of process and event. A game of baseball ending by a score of 1-0 after 4 hours and 17 minutes of play, and a game of cricket ending at tea time on the 5th day after the scoring of over 1,000 runs should clearly be analysed differently. The whole role of event is different in these two situations. Different historical paradigms are needed to describe it. The empire of the 4th century was faced by an unprecedented array of invaders, and its survival depended on the government's ability to address a multitude of problems. Here they are defending Italy in the early 5th century, and here's part of their army of the same period. Behind all of these issues, I can't emphasize this too strongly, is the sheer physical dimension of the Roman Empire in relation to the speed of transport and its changing margins of safety as the problems present themselves on different frontiers all at the same time. And I like this picture here. Pick it out. It's the outline map of the Roman Empire with an outline map of the USA superimposed on it, so you can see it at the same size. And this is an environment, 3,500 miles across, an entity where the average traveller can only expect to accomplish 20 or 25 miles a day. The problems of manipulating distant crises in that situation are more than we can imagine. It was just too much to do. If the fall of the empire is a failure of government, it's a failure born not just of inherent weakness, but of weakness, if as established, in combination with adverse and changing circumstances. One more point. There is something to add. If you remember how Gibbon characterized the fall of the Roman Empire as a triumph of barbarism and Christianity. Christianity was another of the causes of the decline of the ancient world, reviewed by Rostovtzeff on the last pages of his book. But he denies its special force. It was just one side of the general change of the mentality of the ancient world. Now that's where I think Anderson was right in telling Rostovtzeff that he really ought to try to be a bit clearer than he was being, because you begin with something nice and precise and clear like Christianity. Now you finish with mentality, and you've gone from the precise to the general. It shouldn't be allowed. Rostovtzeff made clear that his book was a social and economic history of the Roman Empire, and not of its religion, art and culture. But it's inherent in his approach, and we would agree, that these things are all connected. There is one way in which religious change, taken in its own terms, might support his general view of the role of culture in society. As the anarchy of the 3rd century gave place to the despotism of the 4th, and as the despotism itself adopted Christian dress under Constantine and his successors, and here's in fact Constantius II, his successor, in triumph, really entering a city in triumph. What I want to point out is this large shield on the left with a huge Christian monogram engraved across it. He's also, of course, been preceded by a dancing Maenad, just as if he was in 3rd century BC. That's what they do. As this happened, the new religion may have helped to bridge some of the cultural chasms that had opened up since the age of the Antonines. The first bridge is between a new governing imperial class, many of whom were recruited from less fashionable cultural parts of the Roman Empire, and the populations whom they governed. In the early empire, there's a sense that the populations are, as it were, are governed by people superior to themselves, from superior social classes. In the late empire, that's less so. The people governing the populations are from less elevated social circles and from less fashionable areas too. A closing of the gap between government and governed in sociological terms, I think. Here's the Emperor Honorius doing the same thing in the early 5th century. This is dated 406. He does the same thing. He, in nomine Christi, vincar semper, may you always be victorious in the name of Christ. In one hand, in the other hand, he holds a figure of victory as if he was an early Roman emperor. They have it both ways. Government and people could communicate within a broader social franchise and classical culture the possession of an elite had allowed their predecessors to do. The emperors, the leaders of local communities, and the people could share a religion and a way of speaking that were not those of an elite. They shared a holy book, the Bible, written, whether in Latin and Greek versions, in a simpler language than Demosthenes and Cicero, and expounded even more simply by Christian clergy to their congregations. Whether this is a providential miracle or a witch's brew is a matter of opinion. As one witnesses the emergence of traditions of theological disputes, of a complication that has nothing to do with the text on which it was based. Never has so much been made of so little as in Christian theology, either intellectually or in the justification of coercive power. If its proponents succeeded in reordering the relationship between the urban masses, their civic leaders and the emperors, they also opened the way to unprecedented programs of legal suppression. I've spoken a lot about liberty, and I want to end with this note. The English word heresy is simply a transcription of the Greek hieresis, an abstract noun formed from the verb to choose. A choice, therefore, or the act of choosing, what we might call an option. How the word for choice became to justify one of the most systematic repressions known in Western history is an interesting question. Roman law maintained the principle, and the Digest of Justinian declared, that what a person thinks cannot be an offence, only what he may do in consequence of it. It can be a fragile distinction, as you can imagine, as we can see in the treatment of crimes like treason and magic arts. Indeed, of Christianity itself in its early days. But it's normal for a society to have rules against behaviour that it thinks threatens it. There was never any doubt that black magic designed to harm the bodies and souls of men was illegal. But harmless white magic, designed, as Constantine put it, for the protection of crops and the preservation of health, presented no problem to the Roman government. Of course, Constantine meant to prevent nothing so beneficial. It may be an interesting question in itself, but I can't see that it makes much difference to the exercise of government whether or not the son was begotten of the father. As any supporter of the old gods would have said, who knows what the truth may be. Only from the 4th century do we see the Roman government clothing itself in the values of an institution dedicated to the imposition of correct thought on matters for which there is no evidence. If we are asking about the end of the ancient world, that is to say, the end of a mentality, and not just the fall of the Roman Empire, the elimination of freedom of belief and the growing disrespect for empirical grounds for belief demand our attention. Thank you.